Hi, I'm Kate Gleim with KatieDidDesign.com, and I'd like to share with you the different foams that you'll work with when you're doing arrangements. This is the basis for many of the designs that you'll create, and this is what holds your materials. There's two different types of foam. There's many manufacturers, but the basic differences is styrofoam versus your dry flower foam, which is kind of a segue of Oasis, which is a brand name. It's kind of like Kleenex being a brand name, but we cover all sorts of different foams with that. My favorite is this particular one because of the density that it has, and that is the difference between styrofoam and dry flower foam is its density. Styrofoam is much more open, but if you're doing very large designs, it's a much more secure foam to work with. What I tend to do is combine the two of them if I'm doing large designs, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But it also comes, your dry flower foam, in browns and greens. It really in the end doesn't matter which color you have because you're going to use moss over the top of it to cover it up anyways. The most important thing is to get the density that you like to work with, and that you'll probably find just depends on what you work with the most. I also look for one that doesn't have a lot of dust created when you cut it and work with it. You'll probably find to start with it just happens to be which one you can get a hold of the easiest. So to begin with, let's use our dry flower foam. And in most arrangements, what you're looking for is to be able to maximize your foam as much as possible. Whenever you're creating something, budget's an issue. So you want to use as much foam as necessary, but as little foam as you can to do the project that you're doing. Generally speaking, if you get your foam to where it fits corner to corner on your edges, that is sufficient. You'll be very surprised at how much you can put into a very small piece of foam. So I start out with, and you just kind of get an overall view of what it's going to look like in the container. Obviously this is much wider than this part of the container. So most often you'll find that you're going to kind of wedge the bottom like so. And I'm using a long bladed knife. You want one that's fairly thin this way. The thicker it is, the harder it is to push it through the foam. So we'll just take those corners off. And then you can kind of set it there and see how it's going to fit, and then decide, well, that's a little bit broad. It's not going to the bottom. So we'll take a bit more off and see how it fits. And you're going to be able to wedge it into the container. If you don't want to make it permanent, you're going to wedge it in there so it's tight enough to work with. Just remembering, if you have a very thin-walled container or an antique or something, you can literally put enough pressure on it that you'll pop the sides out. So you want to be a little cautious there with doing that. The next thing is to determine how high you want the foam to be. If you've got lots of horizontal insertions in the design, you're going to need to let it rise above the container a bit. However, if you're doing some of the ones that we do where you set the materials right on top of it, you'll cut it level with the container. So let's just take this one and assume we're doing some horizontal insertions. And you can see I'm bringing the knife towards my hand like so. This is my foam knife. It's very dull, and I've worked with this for well, we won't even say how many decades I've worked with this knife. But you want to be cautious where you're using your knife, how you're doing it, that you don't end up cutting yourself. So we can take that off. And I've done that a little bit taller than the 1/2 inch, which is standard, just to show you that it's always better to be a bit conservative, and you can always cut it down a little bit further. It doesn't work very well to piece it together. Because if you put glue on it to piece it, then you can't shove your stems through the glue. So now we have it about a 1/2 inch above the edge of the container, and I like to just again wedge cut the corners like so, and all it does is it just gives you a little bit more surface when you go to make the insertions in the design. And that container is foamed and ready to have moss or whatever you're going to use on top done. The other way would be to take this and cut it off right level with the top of the container, and then you're going to be placing materials like if you're doing sprays, picks, candle rings, that type of thing that you sit on top. that will sit with the rim of the container. We'll then also have situations where you want to completely fill the container. So we're going to do the same thing we did on the last one. Cut the corners off so it sets down in there. And I want to make this very firm. So I'm going to actually put a little bit of hot glue on the base of this and glue it to the bottom of the container. Voila, like so. And you can see it's not contacting the edges of the container right here. That can be a problem if you're doing heavy stems or get a little carried away with the design, because you can literally crack it loose from the bottom because you've got enough wiggle room in there. So we'll take this and let's let that rise above the container a little bit. And to prevent that from happening, you can then wedge cut your foam like so. We're going to take this, I'm going corner to corner on a diagonal. Now I have two wedged cut pieces that will fit down in there like so, and that will prevent the foam from cracking out of there. It now can't wiggle. This is also a good way if you want to have a complete surface of foam. There's certain styles of designs where you want to make insertions throughout the complete surface of the container, and so you can do that same thing in there. Bring your wedges in and cut them to fit the top. And then you'll have a complete surface of foam covering that you can make insertions into all the way through the surface of the container. Next, let's look at our styrofoam. Styrofoam comes in green and white, and again, doesn't make any difference really what color you use, unless you're doing a wintry Christmas scene and you want to cover it up with snow or something. Then obviously the white's going to be easier to cover than the green would be. But for standard designs, either color works just fine. We'll take this. Generally speaking, you're going to get it either in 1 inch or 2 inch. 2 inch works for most situations. 1 inch foam is nice as a platform if you're doing vignettes and little scenes and that type of thing. Sometimes you want it thinner, but for doing your standard arrangements, 1 inch foam is good. So you want to take your container and kind of get a rough idea of how the size is going to fit there. And you can score your foam like that. And the easiest way to do this is to just take it and simply break it against an edge of something. So you're just going to whack it and it'll pop it right off, and then you can fit it into your container. You can also take, and using some candle wax, you'll just run your knife over the candle, and that way it makes it very slick. It cuts through the foam very easily, and this is particularly useful if you're trying to sculpt it and do scenes and things with it as well. So you can then take your knife and bring it all the way through. If you don't want to break it, you just have to score it a couple times and take it through like so. Then, seeing how it fits in your container, oftentimes with styrofoam, you're going to want to have it to where it completely covers the surface, and we'll make it to fit exactly through there. And you can see it sets down in there, so we're going to want to have 2 layers of foam in there to fit. Again, measuring to container size, and it'll set in there perfectly. Now, I know many people work with a glue gun. They're easy and convenient. The problem with glue guns is that the temperature is so hot, it tends to just really melt down into your foam. So when you're working with styrofoam, the best glue, not that you can't make a glue gun glue work, you can, but ideally you work with pan glue. Pan glue melts at about 300 degrees, so it makes an excellent bond with your styrofoam. It won't melt big giant holes into it. Let me pull this one out of here and drop that in there. like so. It's glued to the container now. What you don't want to do when you glue the next piece in is you don't want to completely cover the surface with your glue, because you can't get the stems and things through it. So when you go to glue this one, if you just put a little dab on either end, and then you can take and put a wood pick through it, like so, and that makes a nearly indestructible bond when it's finished. And again, take, just like we did with the regular foam, take your corners off to round it so your foam covers nicely. Another method for doing this is to put your styrofoam layer on the bottom and put a layer of this foam on top. And that way, if you've got a lot of really fine stems, they can go into this easily, and then the big heavy ones can be pushed all the way through this into the styrofoam, making an excellent bond that's very sturdy. So those are the basic methods for working with foam, and you're going to find that almost each instance comes with its own set of problems that you're going to work with. You want to just follow the basics, remembering not to put the glue between your styrofoam so you can't insert your stems through it, and to be very cautious of thin wall containers. And if you have a container that you don't want to damage, and so you don't want to use pan glue or hot glue with it, you're just going to need to gently wedge the foam in there with those extra wedges on the side to keep it nice and stable. Thank you for joining us.